And as we take the stage, I'd like to introduce our panel for our first conversation today. Of course, Dr. Yasmine, Minister in Egypt, is joining us, but we also have Mohieldin, the climate change high-level champion for COP27 in Egypt, joining us, and Damilola Ogunbiyi, the CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, and also a special representative to the UN Secretary General. So please make our panel feel welcome on this Sunday morning, and thank you again for being here. Minister, just to begin, I think the best way to summarize the overall sentiment at the conference so far was from Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber in his opening remarks at the conference. And he said, the world is still way off when it comes to achieving the goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So in your view, how can COP in the Emirates address some of those challenges and build on the progress that was made in Egypt?
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, you know that the COPs were designed that one build upon one another. So it's not an isolation of the multilateralism process. Secondly, I think that there are three parts that I've just mentioned in the opening remarks quickly that would be very essential. First of all, that if we don't want to be far away from the Paris Agreement in 2015, we have a good opportunity to seize, which is the Paris Rule Book, the Sharm el-Sheikh Plan of Implementation, but much more, which is the global goal on adaptation that should be adopted in COP28. And that's very important to look at because the world is looking at that part very importantly, and there are millions and trillions of finance that would go for adaptation just if the target is being set. Secondly, the global stocktake is also one important part that we can seize in order to put further implementation to the Paris Agreement. Last but not least, the loss and damage, also the fund that was dedicated in COP27 and the governance of that fund, and how can we further look into the implementation and the actual disbursement of that fund. These are three important issues because they have to work parallel with the mitigation actions with the NDCs and looking further on how countries are implementing NDCs because the first reporting will take place in 2024. So we have a very good opportunity in COP28 in November to see how countries will be able to finalize and report back on their updated NDCs. Thank you.
And achieving progress is particularly challenging at the moment because what we've seen coming into COP28 and all through COP27 is this chorus of criticism being leveled towards the oil and gas industry. And I want your reaction to this as well. What do you say to those critics who claim that the COP process is basically a bloated expedition of oil and gas executives, photo shoots for politicians, and all being run by special interests and lobbies? How do you react to that?
I react simply that oil and gas is part of the problem like any other industry, and they have to be present in that part in order to present what they can do into that. If we are always saying that the COP should be inclusive because the crisis affects us all, then everyone has to be around the table. Let me give you a good example aside from the oil and gas, the heavy industries, the cement industry or the fertilizers industry. Why they shouldn't also be criticized that they are around the table. In Egypt, there was a day for the decarbonization, and that was the first time that we have that day. We know that there were a lot of criticism on why are we including that in the discussion. They should be part of that discussion in order to be faced with the reality that you, as emitter, as part of the pollution, you need to come up and step in and say whether you're credible, whether you will be able to be committed, and how you're going to do that, and how you're going to make that transition. Starting that dialogue in COP27 was really essential, not to exclude, but to include and face the fact that what you are going to do in that part and how you are going really to make a difference if you are going to make a difference. And the world will be watching and will be evaluating and assessing that.
And just one more question before I open it up to the panel, but do you also think that there is a public perception gap here? Because I also get the sense that it's quite hard for the general public to square the fact that you can have a major fossil fuel producer like the UAE also being a global leader in climate. How do you address that public perception gap and sell this to the general public who may not understand that those two things can be directly correlated?
I think that the only way that you can do that is to present an actual commitment and plans that you would be able to fulfill. Sustainability cannot be divided. Sustainability would mean a one-fledged package that you are looking at the environmental, at the economic, and at the social aspects. Once that's even away from the climate, once that is being very clear and you're committed to do that, and yet also you need to look at how best will you be able to make that transition. The transition is not only for a country rather than the other. The transition would mean a just transition, that those who need the transition should be avail the time, the technology, and the finance. And those who have the finance should be avail the time and show the targets and respect those targets on making that kind of the transition. Because the fact says, for sustainability, the regular oil and gas and the regular fossil fuel cannot live longer and will not be able to ensure the demands of our future generation. So the shift to the renewables is a must, and in fact is not an option.
Thank you, Minister. Mahmoud, I'll take it over to you now. And through the COP27 process, we did see great progress on mitigation, adaptation, things like loss and damage and financing in particular. How do you think the UAE can build on the COP27 agenda? And what would you be focusing on here?
Right. Thank you so much. It's great to be in Abu Dhabi, and it's great as well to start the year with an event with the Atlantic Council, as I ended last year with an event with the Atlantic Council. It was different. It was in insurance and adaptation. They were focusing more on energy, but we take that all from a holistic perspective. That's why I like the introductory remarks by Francesco and, of course, by Her Excellency, the Minister. So on this issue of process and accumulation over time, and it was from the very beginning when Egypt and the UAE were announced in Glasgow to host COP27 and COP28, it was very much an understanding that the outcomes and the conclusions of COP27 are going to pave the way for a successful COP in the United Arab Emirates. And I would really, you put them nicely in the order of the Paris Agreement. I think Sharm el-Sheikh managed to protect the Paris Agreement and protect the ambitions of Glasgow, including the 1.5 degrees. It made really a breakthrough when it comes to the adaptation agenda with very practical suggestions in partnership with the private sector in areas related to the work in the adaptation, from water management to agriculture to coastal areas to food security and other areas of work. And then the great achievement, and that is really quoting the Secretary General of the UN, he said that this was a huge political achievement, is the loss and damage, because those who are experts, and many of them are in this room, days before reaching the agreement, they were really in doubt that this would ever going to happen. But I think the great work on substance, the great leadership of Egyptian diplomacy, the great work by Germany, Chile, and everybody on the parties and non-parties alike had realized that we cannot really escape from the loss and damage and dilute it under different notions, including adaptation. What's common between the three? It's all of the elephant in the room. It's finance. Without finance, you cannot really have any progress in mitigation. Adaptation will be an interesting academic notion. And loss and damage is all about finance. So how can we deal with that is basically going to be the discussion that we'll be having here in Abu Dhabi today and during the Sustainability Week as well. It's easy to talk about the 100 billion, but we know now it's a drop in the ocean when it comes to requirements of finance. It's no more than 3% of the requirements of total finance for when it comes to developing economies and emerging markets, even if you put advanced economies and China aside. So we need really to have serious money. How this money is going to be coming from? There are some suggestions here. One, this could be coming out of generosity. And this could be very much a call of optimism in this regard. Others say, well, it could be out of fairness. Those who have been polluting the world for almost 200 years may realize today it's about time to contribute. The third aspect could be, which is more relevant, could be about efficiency gains, the mutual benefits of investments in mitigation and adaptation, but in a new way to make adaptation with reward to those who are investing in it, including from the private sector. And then, if you are not really going to be convinced of any of the three arguments, there is the fear factor. And it's either fear about the planet or fear about your livelihoods. That it's a very serious argument that if we're not going to get our act together, not just about the impact of global warming and what will happen in 2030, 2050 and beyond, but immediately we see the threats of forced migration. Immediately we see the fear of a new phenomena with climate refugees. And there is an interesting book on this by a good author. It's called The Nomad Century, with the heat map that we know now that it happened that low-income countries, poorer countries, are in warmer areas of the planet. They will be forced to leave their villages and towns, and there will be nothing to stop them unless there is something that we can do today to prevent that from happening. So the loss and damage is the kind of the prevention act that is definitely will be costly, but the cost of it will be much less than if we wait for the outcomes of doing nothing.
It's a perfect setup for my question to Damilola as well, and good morning to you, Damilola, because what we also know is that equity and inclusivity are critical tenets here too, and of course the concept of a just transition was also principal in the Paris Climate Accord. So explain to us a bit more about your role and why this concept of a just transition is also critical in this climate conversation.
Well, good morning to you, and thank you for having me here at the Atlantic Council. Why the notion of a just transition is so important is because when we're talking about transitioning, we forget that a lot of people don't even have sufficient energy. So when we talk about the developing world and my continent, Africa, we're talking the just transition to them is getting enough energy to survive, getting enough energy to live a dignified life. We're starting at a scenario where per capita, the average African with the installed capacity has barely 404 kilowatt hours in sub-Saharan Africa. That is kind of 20 times less than the average American. So the just is really important. For the first time in history, we actually truly have the chance for when people are getting energy, it to be clean, it to be renewables. But you can't forget the fact that a lot of economies, they want to industrialize. There's a lot of things people want to do with energy. So we shouldn't just look at, one side of the world and forget another side. There's nowhere in our climate promises where you can go ahead and hit net zero and leave 1 billion people in energy poverty. It just doesn't happen that way. So as we're talking about the just, as we're talking about equity, as we're talking about just the right thing to do, we also have to talk about the reality that this will mean more energy for a certain region in the world, and it means that the developed world has to use less. Energy efficiency is the best fuel source to try and mitigate. You have to use less to make sure other people have more and they can come up again. So in our work at Sustainable Energy 4, really focus on that, and we have different partners, and some are here today. Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, to say what is the best way of making sure people are truly not left behind. And it's not about, no offense to people in the solar home system space, but it's not about giving a solar lantern and ticking a box that you've electrified somebody. It's giving enough energy for people to live dignified lives.
Damilola went viral just recently. Was it a Vox documentary that landed on Netflix?
Yeah.
You were speaking inside this documentary, which is incredible, by the way, and you can find it on the internet and watch it. It's very, very good. But within the documentary, it was revealed that by 2030, climate change is expected to push an additional 132 million people into extreme poverty, and many of them are going to be women, girls, and marginalized communities. So, Damilola, just how serious is that challenge and the issue that policymakers are facing today in addressing it?
I think sometimes when we are in these forums or we are in countries like this, we sometimes forget that the people that we're really trying to help, at least in my role, are people who it's a difference between life and death. So for example, a woman cutting down trees using fuel wood could die prematurely because of this. It does happen. About 1 million women, already die because they're using fuel wood every day, instead of using other cleaner sources of energy. For me, it's quite upsetting because that's not seen as an emergency. And everything has to be seen as emergency. Apart from the deforestation it causes, it's actually affecting human life. Before we talk about all the insurgencies, all the refugees that are actually leaving because of climate, there are key emergencies happening now. And these are solvable problems, right? We always talk about technology breakthroughs, which are so important, but everything we need to provide power to the people who don't have it, electricity and clean cooking, exists today. What doesn't exist, which Mahmoud was talking about, is the financing to do it. And even the political will exists. In my continent, I never thought I would see presidents coming and saying, we want to do the energy transition. Tell us how to do it. So you were sitting down with them, we're planning with them, but honestly, we don't know how it's going to be financed, which isn't a good place to be. So that's why we're looking for different innovative ways of financing. And one is what we're also presenting at the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, which is the African Carbon Market Initiative. How do we massively scale up the use of high-integrity carbon markets that people can buy from Africa as a way to fund the transition, of which energy access and provision of energy is at the heart of it.
Minister, this is an issue that you know all too well in Egypt and across the continent. How did COP27 move the needle on inclusion and equity, if at all?
Okay, thank you very much. Egypt was actually very keen since we started the process of preparation to make sure that it is an inclusive COP. So first of all, every year we have what's called the World Youth Forum, and that took place in January, and we made different sessions to include the youth. We worked even together with the UAE in the last year Sustainability Week in order to engage in a group of the Arab youth working for climate. That was one part. Another part is that we worked together with the Secretariat to include a number of African NGOs that were not usually part of the UNFCCC process, but we wanted to make sure that they are well represented, and our famous story of the Green Zone. The Green Zone is a part that usually it's the responsibility of the hosting government to do it, to present its cases and so forth. Our president was very keen that our Green Zone would be a walking distance from the Blue Zone. That's number one. Number two, that it does not only include the national entities, so it's not telling the story of Egypt, but it included parts where we invited different international organizations such as universities from the academic and international NGOs, and even indigenous people and local communities from around the world to present their cases if they are not allowed to the regular UNFCCC process. And last but not least, as we designed the Blue Zone on different thematic days, the thematic days were taking place in the Green Zone to ensure that their voices are discussing the same issues that we would like to discuss as part of the presidency program. So all that was efforts that were done over 11 months to ensure that an inclusive COP is meaningful, is implementable, and comes out with tangible results.
Mahmoud, can you add to that as well?
Right. In terms of the actionable measures, in the levels of action that you want all of that to be translated in, how to get finance, investment into the right direction, these are with 3 levels. First, I would say the local level, and there have been a great deal of localization of efforts of climate action, not just to raise awareness, but the opportunities and the final impact will be where people live, in their townships, in their cities, and their urban areas or rural areas. And we had a very good initiative called the Green Smart Projects, in which we managed to mobilize the interest of the private sector and all of the businesses from the micro enterprises to the mega projects with two notions, green and smart, as the main transformation for the future. And that is basically an area of work that's going to be a permanent feature of the work in Egypt, with an idea as well through the partnership with the UN that we want to scale that up as well. At the regional level, I'm happy, and I see my good friend, the director for the Africa region of the Champions, Bugulu here, that we had 5 regions of the UN, including Africa, and in partnership with GFANs, with consultancy firms, we have a pipeline of projects, because that was always a big question by investors. We have the money. You remember the GFAN's promise of asset-backed entities ready to direct funding, but they say, well, we have the money, but we don't have the pipeline of projects. So we worked hard for like 5-6 months in order to have pipeline of projects, and they are available in compendium on the UNFCCC and in the 5 regions of the UN. And you'll see good mix of projects. Many of them, as you may expect, could be more in the mitigation front and energy, including renewables. But we saw growing interest with better packaging and incentives in areas related to adaptation as well. On the work on the regions, happy as well to see debt reduction mechanism being tested, including investments that are required to be linked to debt reduction, and get the investments into nature and into climate. Good examples came from Seychelles, from Belize, a fantastic project as well from Barbados, which is basically having KPIs linked to the NDCs of, in the case of Barbados, that could really be replicated elsewhere. And here you can really see the beauty of partnerships between governments, private sector, and credit enhancers. Then the big work, which is basically about the global level. Here, of course, we'll talk about the future of finance, the $100 billion. The COP26 with COP27 have produced this piece about a good costing exercise for what's required. What we need as a minimum is $1 trillion from now until the end of 2025. This figure will be no less than $2.4 trillion after 2025 until 2030. And here, the idea of getting more efficient long-term finance with improved terms of funding. I'm arguing for no more than 1% to be spent on climate-related activities. Maturities shouldn't be no less than 10 years, grace period 10 years, and maturity for no less than 20 years. And there are some models in different multilateral development banks that already have something similar to that, like IDA, like the IMF with the Resilient Sustainability Trust Fund. And of course, the good example of the carbon credit market. This is a very big area of work that requires global standards with good capturing of the value, good regulations, and I'm happy that Egypt just a couple of days ago issued the regulations for the carbon credit market. And again, with the initiative on Africa and capturing the value, we have something similar with GFAN's Africa. So I see the movements at the 3 levels, the local, the regional, and the global. But basically what we need, quoting a prominent economist, Esther Duflo, she says, well, the solutions are not very different from what the minister and my good friend Damilola just mentioned. It's about finance, technology, as you mentioned, but there is something missing, which is leadership. It's not just the political leadership, leadership in sectors, leadership in the civil society, and we hope through this process and the work that we'll be seeing in the road to COP28, we can really get this kind of leadership more and more materialized into action, because without that, we wouldn't have got some of the main achievement that we had during the previous COPs.
Just on this issue of financing, clearly a major challenge. And to go back to what Dr. Sultan was saying, in his speech, he said, and I quote, "To achieve the Paris goal, global emissions must fall 43% by 2030 at a time of continued economic uncertainty, heightened geopolitical tensions, and increasing pressure on energy security." That so-called energy trilemma. So certainly not an easy backdrop. How do you de-risk this for investors, and how do you incentivize governments to be moving money in the right direction here?
I was very pleased to see in the conclusion of this survey conducted by the Atlantic Council that there is a great interest in investing in renewables. As we know, roughly speaking, between 2021 and 2022, the investments were ranging between $365 billion to $400 billion in renewables. This figure needs really to be multiplied. The factors are between 6 to 7. The good thing is that the reward for such investments are realized. The issue of risk mitigation is the main issue of concern. And here, the multilateral development banks, the like of the African Development Bank, the World Bank, my former employer, and many others, including for the private sector, can do a great job in this area. But for their work, I'm worried about a drift in terms of action. That holistic approach that was emphasized by Francesco, by the minister, by Damilola. You cannot really say, well, we are going to be taking only energy and renewables and leave the rest of the story. In this time of crises, multiple crises, you need to have inclusive growth for jobs to deal with the poverty reduction. Now we are at levels much worse than what we started with the SDGs in 2015. It's not the expected 130 million added that Damilola mentioned because of problems related to energy. We already had lost almost a decade of work in that front. So the private sector work is very much realized in mitigation. What we need is some sort of nudging, help, and some sort of packaging of the project, especially in the frontier markets. When it comes to adaptation, here I would really argue that the very able and competent ministers from developing economies should ask for more funding for adaptation and give the way to the private sector and don't crowd out the private sector. The private sector needs just to be leveraged in that front. And then we will see in the coming weeks, through the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, through the work of the Loss and Damage Fund, how the good ideas floating around the importance of finance and technology are going to be materialized in the work. That will be a great test by the time we are here again in the UAE in November to discuss these issues.
And Damilola, I think to tie all of this together, the ultimate question that we're trying to answer here is, how is this move away from fossil fuels ultimately going to impact socio-economic development? And how do we ensure that that move away doesn't cause a backsliding in socio-economic development? Your view?
I mean, it's important to understand the energy needs and what the energy is used for. That is very fundamental. So just from my engineering background, it's really important to understand how energy systems work, what it means for baseload, what types of energy you need, and then to understand how people want to develop. There's no scenario where you can actually succeed without having energy development and climate together. And that's what we've been trying to do in saying that, you know, when you're telling countries, because this is a whole shift of an economic change in countries, you have to go and say, what exactly is your energy transition pathway? So if you take my country, Nigeria, Nigeria made it very clear. We needed to uplift 100 million people out of poverty, and we needed to uplift our industrial base. And if you can do it clean, that's your problem, but figure it out. So we need to take in consideration what the country wants. What we do a lot of time is take these regional approaches to a very localized problem. There's a vast difference from the energy transition plan in Nigeria to our neighbors in Ghana, to Kenya, you know, but you say, oh, Africa as a whole. Africa is full of different countries and different nuances. Even in my country, what happens in northern Nigeria is different from what happens in southern Nigeria. So you have to understand that. That's the just and the energy part of it. And you also understand this takes a long time. The Nigerian president at COP28 announced they will get to net zero at 2060, not 2050, because when you looked at the transport sector, the industrial sector, the oil and gas sector, it just wasn't possible. So being realistic about what a country has to do is important. And lastly, I have to touch on the finance again, because for a country like Nigeria to get to net zero with perfect policies, perfect political stability between now and 2060 will cost in the regions of $1.9 trillion. So we need to really be realistic when we talk about the numbers of what you're asking countries that are easily spending 80% of their revenue on debt servicing, on interest-only debt servicing, how exactly they're going to do it. So I don't know the solutions, but I'm excited to find how we're going to crack this. But this financing issue is really at the heart of the entire energy transition.
We have about 10 minutes left on stage here, but if anyone has a question for the Minister or our other panelists, please raise your hands and we can get a microphone over to you. It's also your opportunity to ask some questions as well, so by all means, if you do have a question, please raise your hand. But to continue the conversation, I think we can also look at this other issue of just energy access as well. 800 million people around the world still don't have access to energy. As I understand it, the global population will probably reach around 9.7 billion, 10 billion people by 2050. We're going to need 30% more energy than what we currently have today. So what would be your view, Damilola first, on the biggest transition risk right now? What do you see it as?
I mean, like I said, it's 800 million without access, but it's actually 1 billion people in energy poverty because you have electricity doesn't mean you have it constantly. And what those figures don't talk about is the 2.4 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking as well. So when we talk about energy, we have to talk about both. I mean, the greatest risk is leaving those people behind. It's continuing with growing demands of energy elsewhere and leaving those people behind. And that's why energy efficiency is just so important. And we've seen it around Europe when people got high energy bills, they started using less. And that's the thinking that, you know, in developing countries, there's hardly any waste because people don't have enough to use in the first place. So we really need to come together and look at what is the social return on investment by giving power to these people, affects GDP, affects jobs. It creates whole industries if we do focus as well with our efforts for places that don't have it. It's also important because if those people get electricity the way the rest of the world has, using very dirty fuels, we're going to go back in about 2 decades again saying we want to transition again, and we don't have to do that.
Mahmoud, can you speak to that?
If I can build on that, there are 2 things. One, at the global level. If we're not going to be dealing with a problem that is very much upon us, it's going to derail all efforts related to finance and investment, because what we see on the recession, fears of stagflation, low growth in developing economies and advanced economies, investments prospects in 23 and 24 are on average less than where they were in 2020 by 5% to 8%. So here we need really to see what kind of investment effort that we need to push in order to deal with the problems related to climate action, as it is part of sustainable development, not an isolated one. The second thing, that we have more than 60% of developing economies and emerging markets are in some form of debt distress. If you are a developing economy, you are either at a debt challenge or a debt crisis or a debt catastrophe. And that cannot really be left for time to be solved. And there could be some relaxed folks around there because they say, well, advanced economies and their financial systems are protected. It's not the global financial crisis. No, but that may have triggering effect as part of the supply chain. And if we are going to be seeing these scattered fires, that will catch the rest of the economy. So we need really to have, through G7, G20, it's good that both Egypt and India, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates are invited as guests for the G20. So hopefully the issues related to priorities for climate action are going to be reflected in the discussion in India. And then at the project level, what made the news in Glasgow, what made the news when it comes to projects in Sharm el-Sheikh, are the projects related to what's so-called JETP projects, the Just Energy Transition initiatives. And South Africa was first, then we heard about Indonesia, then another project in Vietnam. And all of these projects are ranging between $8 billion to more than $15 billion. What we need to see is some serious actions in these country platforms, because they are going to be transformational. The way that they are designed are fantastic, phasing out from fossil, investing in renewables, dealing with the impact on community. This is really nice when it comes to design. What is missing so far is basically the kind of action that we need to see, not just in these 3 countries, but in the rest of the countries, including in Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
Minister, would you like to add to that as well, and perhaps offer a view on what you see as the biggest transition risk from here?
Thank you. I think the transition risk is that not only, as Dr. Mahmoud has mentioned, on the part related to the finance or the projects, but also one important part on the transition risk is very much related to the culture and the mindset. Even when you started earlier discussing the public perception, the just transition, as we need to invest in technology, we need to invest in finance, and we need to invest on plans and time and give countries that part, we need to invest in changing the mindset of the public of how can that be done. For example, Egypt as a country has been facing for quite a long time the waste, the municipal solid waste. And every time we started engaging in that discussion, we fail on that part on different fronts, on tackling the informal sector, on putting the laws in place, in including the private sector, in even collecting and doing more infrastructure work. Part of the change that we have been trying to do is investing in the way people looking at the garbage and how that can be dealt with. The first part that we have done beside the law is the way we have been addressing the young people and school children in order to change the mindset, and how can that be done. Two things that we have been trying to do. First, working on what kind of green jobs could be done within the waste sector, what are they offering, and how can that be included. Secondly, working with the youth and the young children. Even we have in Egypt a very famous group of young people who clean up the Nile, and they are called the Very Nile. And the moment we went down with them, everyone, by the way, and that's part of the public perception, was getting ironic and sarcastic, saying, why are you cleaning the Nile when your streets are still full of garbage? But that is taking a lot of courage and being bold to do that kind of work. So one thing that I would recommend for a just transition is to invest in the human resources, changing the mindset and the culture, and doing that kind of an alternative jobs that could be provided, and how can those jobs come at the very local level. And here I talk about the rural areas. For example, part of what we've been facing is the burning of the rice straw that comes up with the methane and with the increase in the greenhouse gases and air pollution, and all Cairo would be a black cloud over 2.5 months. Part of what we've been providing is a job opportunity of the recycle of the rice straw, getting compost, getting fertilizer, but including also the women in the rural area for providing clean energy. So that's, I think, is very important and key, because finance and technology will not solve if we keep the same mindset within the same reach.
It's a very good point and very important to add. Thank you, Minister. And we have a few minutes left. Does anyone in the room have a question for the Minister or any of our other panelists? Thought I'd open the floor, give you the opportunity to have your say.
Okay.
No, I think we're okay. Oh, in the front, sir. We'll try and get a microphone over to you if we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask Dr. Mahmoud, how does he see the energy transition contributing to economic diversification in the MENA region?
Well, this is a very good question that had been raised before the time of COVID and before the war in the Ukraine. And there was a very important piece that came out from the IMF about where the demand for fossil fuel in the GCC will be reaching its peak. There was some similar work as well that was conducted for Norway. And here the discussions were basically about the peak will be some year like 2027 or 2029 based on different models. And then we got this piece by Daniel Yergin on the new map. And then, of course, the idea there is not a factor of time, it's a factor of technology. We are where we are today in energy and diversification of the sources of energy because the huge investments in invention in countries like the US and Europe, and development, research and development at scale in China. That's why you see some projects, including here in Masdar, in Egypt, in Bimban, in Ouazzazate, in Morocco, with a fraction of their cost only 9 or 10 years ago. But diversification here is not just about diversifying the sources of energy. But being in Abu Dhabi, I'd just like to emphasize this point, that this country have been prepared for that. When Masdar was established in 2006, I listened carefully to His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, when he said that the day that the UAE will be exporting, the last barrel of oil will be a day of celebration, because we are going to be prepared for it. We are going to be with a diversified sources of energy and diversified economy that's not going to be mourning the day that we lost this source of energy. So it's good to have this kind of midterm, long-term planning. The first part of the investment that are required for the GCC countries have been always the investments in skills. When the discussions, especially with the WEF talks about the fourth industrial revolution, about the investments in the fourth industrial revolution related kind of investments, scaling up the population and how to do the digitalization better, this was a source of interest here. And then investments in areas related to the services sector and manufacturing that could be with high value-added component. And there are many good examples that we can really get from countries, especially from Latin America, that were very much dependent on commodities and they were hit by the ups and downs of the cycles. So it's all, I think, there is a great deal of learning by doing in this region. And we have seen the prices of oil and in their 100s plus, and we saw them in the negatives during in the futures market and COVID. So I think it's basically about how to diversify better. I'm not worried about the areas related to investments in fiscal and on the finance, but more needed definitely on matters related to the skills and the human capital. That I would borrow from my good friend Damilola here, is basically when you talk about the region at large, there could be these kind of generic kind of suggestions. But what could be good for Bahrain may not be necessarily good for the UAE or Qatar or Saudi Arabia. So some sort of granularity on the design as we see it in the vision for 2030, for instance, in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The first and last line in those reports were basically starting with diversification, and the last point was basically gaining the momentum from the diversification investment. So it's on the mind of the policymakers, and we see some sort of a good pace in that direction. But that needs to be done in a faster pace and not to be misled by sudden prices in fossil fuel, because we know that they don't last forever.
Excellent question. Does anyone else in the room? Over here, sir. We'll try and get a microphone to you. There it is, over there.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question to Damilola with reference to the point you astutely made, that it's very easy to talk about the urgency of things like the refugee crisis. But there is an urgency, obviously, that's pre-existing and is, as indicated by you, to do with how many people are living currently, whether or not they're moving across into different countries. What would you like to see? What would you think would be an impactful way to approach this year's COP in order to land that understanding so that action could be more effective?
Thank you. I think I've mentioned it a few times. It's all about money right now. You know, there has to be a concerted effort on funding the transition in developing countries, knowing that energy access is at the heart of that transition, and, you know, developing industry and jobs. People don't like to live where they are, leave where they are because they just want to. They leave because they don't feel that they can get, you know, what they need from their locality. And we see that, the climate issue has caused lots of conflicts, have caused lakes drying up. There's a lot of things happening, on continent and developing countries that can be avoided if there was just this effort. And this effort isn't just going to come from the private sector. It's hard for the private sector sometimes to even fund emerging economies, not to talk about developing countries. So sometimes the public-private partnerships and understanding that you do have to fund government, and developed countries that have caused a lot of these problems do have to put money on the table, because there is a social return on investment which will keep people hopefully in their localities and bring the economic growth that we want for everybody.
Fantastic. Is there perhaps time for one more question? Yes, sir, in the front here.
Just in relation to finance, should we not be talking about the value created? So, that's a huge opportunity rather than how much it's going to cost. The other aspect is to put to the panel, we also might need to make the link between energy and healthcare, because from air pollution, that's a huge cost. And also our health system, we've seen from COVID, huge pressures. So there's a huge opportunity to make a link between global energy and healthcare. So I put that to the panel. How do we do that?
Thank you. Let me touch base on that, because one part that we have been doing in COP27, two parallel global initiatives. One that was talking about the nutrition and what kind of food that you need to change in the practices of the sustainable food and what kind of emissions that are related to that. And another part on the gender, as we are very much not only interested but believing also on the part related to the woman, is the energy, water, and food nexus. One part related to that is the more you're using your energy and making that just transition, even at the local level and at the level of the small and medium household, and using that renewable energy for irrigation and for food systems, that would make a very good package. It's a package that will be at the heart of the human development process, but it's a package that would strengthen the resilience of the woman, provide the food, you're using the renewable energy, you're making access to water, you're working on the nutrition, the food practices. The whole package that I'm talking about is making us more resilient to the diseases. We're making us more strength and more power, and we are making that kind of a shift and the energy transition and using it properly in a circular way.
If I can add just a couple of seconds. The issues related to health, the impact on nature, are not adequately factored in the decision-making. So we realize the cost, but when we do the accounting for the returns, we do only the accounting for the financial returns of the projects. If we are putting into consideration the cost to the health system, as you mentioned, to the nature at large, and very few even OECD countries are doing that in the national accounting. That needs to change. The regulatory structure and the incentives need to be changed. And that could be the way in order to provide the proper incentives, in addition to the nexus approach the minister mentioned, but there is an issue related to regulations. And one very final thing, the issues about, I don't like to leave it in a worrying part, but the issues related to forced migrants because of climate, the issues related to refugees are not an issue of far distant kind of a problem. These are imminent problems. If we check what happened in this region, in Yemen and Syria, before the developments that we all know in 2011, it had something to do with the climate, and I refer you to the Ian Bremmer book on the crises. And while I wouldn't go to the estimates of 1.2 billion refugees in 2050 by Zurich and others, but basically look now on how many millions in Pakistan, for instance, are displaced within their country, and how many of them are looking for opportunities outside Pakistan because of what they are in today. So it's basically, we have the solutions, finance, technology, what is missing, leadership, and basically, hopefully, through COP28, we can get some better solutions into that direction.
So just very quickly, totally agree on healthcare. We actually launched a Powering Healthcare Guide yesterday with Irina, which is looking at how to provide power to 10,000 health facilities across the African and parts of Asia as well. These are easy, deployable, renewable solutions that can be used to actually treat people, because it's estimated about 1.2 billion people, I believe, go to healthcare centers and have no access to electricity, so they have no access to healthcare. Thanks.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want you to thank my panelists.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Minister, Mahmoud, and Damilola, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening in.